It's time. Shall we start? And people can join as and when they come. Well, hello everyone. As you can see, we're back here at the Willoughby Wallace Library with Tom Lawrenson for another one of his absolutely gripping presentations, this one on the islands of Scotland. And if you've been here before, you're familiar with Tom. He's taken us around Scotland and told us about all the things we didn't know about lighthouses and golf. And here we are now today. We're going to, and of course, it was, I think if you missed it, you can go and find it on our website, the presentation on the Viking Fire Festival in Scotland on the Shetland Islands. So today we're going to talk about, or well, he's going to talk about it. We're going to hear about the islands in Scotland and their history, their culture. We're going to see some beautiful pictures and we're going to hear some lovely stories. Tom is a raconteur par excellence. He is a storyteller, and I do ask everyone, please do mute your audio and your video. Can you just turn your audio and your video off, please, everyone? Thank you very much. So that Tom can begin.
And I always have it on silent.
And then at the end of this, if we have some time, please feel free to ask questions, or better still, to post your comments and questions in our chat box, and Tom will try to answer as many as he can or respond to as many as he can. Tom, I'm going to turn this over to you. I'm going to hang on. You're the host, Tom. So do you? Okay, there you go.
Okay, I think we're away. Once I can get this going. Okay, with any luck, everybody's seeing a blue screen by now, and I hope everybody can hear me. Questions at the end, yes, I like questions at the end. I answer them if I can, and if I can't, I try to provide a suitably entertaining story about something else, just like politicians do. It's the same process. So we're going to take a hop, skip, and a jump through 4 Scottish islands. 4 of them, you probably know the names of 2 of them, possibly, certainly 1, but possibly 2. And there are 2 that you may not have heard of before, so you're going to hear about them this evening. Just to put Scotland in its place, that's the latitude of Scotland, way up there, comparable with the, oh, excuse me a moment, comparable with the southern tip of Greenland, the middle of Hudson Bay, and the south coast of Alaska, basically. And the red spot here is where we are, at least those of us in Connecticut, that's where we are. So Scotland as a whole is much further north than we are. And this is a Landsat image, and Glasgow sits in there. That kind of grey splodge in there is Glasgow, and the grey splodge over there is Edinburgh. And we're going to go here, and here, and here, and then way, way up here. And we're going to hear something about history, but we're also going to look into the future. So here's a map showing Scotland, and our first island is going to be Iona. There's an Iona College in New York. I met somebody who was at that college once, and I said, have you ever been there? And she said, well, to the college. Yes, I go to the college. I said, no, to Iona. What do you mean, she said. Didn't know that it was named after this tiny little island off the Scottish coast. The next island we'll look at has the intriguing name of Rum, but oddly enough, it has nothing to do with the drink. That's just one of those things. And the next island is called Skye, even though it's dry land. Well, except when it's raining, which is when it's wet land. And then we're going to go way up to the north to the little island of Unst. Just a few more statistics about the Scottish islands. We have 95 inhabited islands and a whole lot more that are not inhabited. The inhabited islands come out to a population of roughly 95, 96,000. That was from some census or other, but the islands do tend to be losing people. Iona, our first island, has a population of about 125. Rum has even fewer, even though it's a much bigger island, roughly 30. Skye is getting on for 10,000. It's had a bit of a population boom in recent years. And then up to Unst, where there are a mere 720. So here's Iona from the air. It sits off the end of this island, the big island of Mull. And here we're looking north, maybe a little bit to the northeast. And Iona is this long island here. There's a bit of a hill in the northern part of it, and there's really not much to it. To get to it, you have to cross from the mainland to the island of Mull, get all the way across the island of Mull. You can maybe make out the road coming in here, and then catch a ferry across to the island. The reason that Iona features at all is because for many years it was a bit of a crossroads. It sits out there, and if you're going north and south up the coast, it's a place you pass quite regularly. If you're going east-west even, especially if you're involved in this route and you come out and Iona's just round the corner. So it used to be a kind of maritime crossroads in the day when sea travel was far easier than overland travel. And that's what brought it to the attention of an Irish clergyman who decided that the Scots needed civilization, and civilization means religion. And so his task was to bring religion in the form of Christianity to the Scots. And he did that back in the 500s. His name was St. Columba. Well, not while he was working, but after he died, he became a saint, St. Columba. And Iona became a centre for Christianity because it was easy to get from Iona to the north, to the south, and up past Oban and Fort William, and all the way up towards Inverness. Apparently, this particular clergyman visited Loch Ness, which is just up here, and Loch Ness, as you possibly know, has a monster in it, and he met the monster. They apparently parted on good terms. This is the little ferry across to Iona, just a small car ferry. Not too long ago, it was just a passenger ferry, but now we can get vehicles over there. And as you cross, you see that hill that occupies much of the northern part of the island, and the cathedral that was built not at the time of Columbus, not this particular building, but it's where he started. And there are the ruins of a convent and a few other buildings in the area. The cathedral itself was renovated. It had been in ruin, but it was renovated in the 50s. And tradesmen from all over would come and spend a week or maybe two at different times. And it was a collective sort of communal reconstruction. Over here is the hostel. If you're visiting Iona, unless you've got friends or family there, this is probably where you're going to stay. And although it started as a Christian centre, it's far from that now. The cathedral is still a Christian cathedral, but they welcome people of all religions for retreats, and it's well known as a place to go to just relax, recover, recharge your batteries. Inside the cathedral, it's a small cathedral, so it doesn't have the majesty of the large cathedrals, especially the ones you'll find in England and France and Germany. But it does have a certain solidity of character, which is entirely appropriate to the place where it is. There are the cloisters. As a visitor to Iona, you can wander around the cloisters. The whole building is open, so you can wander around and experience the atmosphere of the abbey. It's a very popular tourist destination. And because the Dukes of Argyll traditionally owned the island of Iona, they tended to get themselves buried there. So a fair number of them are there, plus a fair number of Scottish kings, particularly back in the early days when England had cast eyes upon us and wanted to take us over. There are various Celtic crosses about the place, but with the gardens and the ruins, there are plenty of places to just sit and gather your thoughts and recharge the batteries. As I say, it's a very peaceful place. It's not really under any airline routes. There's very little traffic on the island. There's the occasional, well, there's hardly any cars anyway, but there's the occasional vehicle going up and down the road. What you mainly hear is the wind and the waves on the beach. Since it's a small island, whatever direction the wind is blowing, it's blowing onto a beach not too far away. And the hill at the north end, a lot of people go up there, and one sign of I suppose the ecumenical character of the place is that up on the top, apart from the cairn, which is something you tend to find on Scottish hills, you'll see an Israeli, I suppose I'm going to call it a penny, cemented into the top of the hill. People of all religion and indeed of none go to Iona and enjoy the atmosphere of the place. So there's the island after which Iona College is named. And from Iona, we're going to skip north a bit, go past the island of Mull here. We'll pass the headland here, which is Ardnamurchan, and which, as it happens, is the most westerly point of the UK mainland, further west than Land's End. And we're going up to the island of Rum, substantially bigger than Iona. And this is kind of what it looks like from up there. Google Earth is marvelous, isn't it? In the background, we've got Skye, which is where we're going next with its mountains. But Rum has its mountains too. And it's a fairly desolate island. The people were cleared off it in the 1820s. This was a period when people were cleared. You're probably familiar with the clearance of people out of Ireland and out of the Highlands of Scotland. And this island was largely depopulated in the 1820s. The people were driven out basically and had to emigrate to barbarian lands such as, well, North America and perhaps Australia. And it has had very few people there since then. The numbers have gone up and down, but it's never recovered its full population. To get to it, you arrive by ferry into the main community at Kinloch. And Kinloch, well, a loch, as you know, is a body of water. It can be salt water, as is the case here, but there's a wee loch there, and that's fresh water, but we use the word loch, whether it's salt or fresh. And the kin bit means it's at the head of the loch, up here, rather than at the mouth of the loch. You'll find that place name in other places, Kinloch Bervie, Kinloch Leven. But here we just have Kinloch on its own. And if you live on Rum, that's where you live. There's almost nowhere else to live. And we're also going to take a look at this area here, Glen Harris. It's got a very strange little thing that, well, it's the result of a very strange person. Rum is a pretty bleak island, and there are alternative spellings. You can spell it with an H, you can spell it without the H. It really makes no difference. I've heard people, especially in pubs, debate and argue quite vociferously and heatedly about the spelling, but really either will do. The only guidance I can suggest is that if you want to distinguish it from the drink, put the H in it, because the drink doesn't have it. This is one of the reasons why no large population ever lived on Rum. It really doesn't have very much that you could call farmland. It's a place where sheep can do well, where goats can do well, where deer can do well, but that's it. Growing things on Rum, it's just not easy. This is the store and the post office with its little red telephone box. And this is pretty much a centre of island life. Remember, you've got 30 to 40 people there. In the summer, there'll be a few more. There'll be campers who arrive and walkers who arrive to enjoy the hills and explore the island. But with only 30 people, everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows everybody's business. And the post office is one of the main centres of the community. But just behind the village is this, Kinloch Castle. After losing all its people in the 1820s, the island was bought by several people. In other words, it changed hands several times in the latter part of that century, until finally it was bought by a man called Bulloch, who decided that he needed to build a castle so that when he went there to shoot deer, he had a place to stay. So he built this castle, started it in 1897, finished it in 1902. It was remarkable in that it was one of the first places in Britain to have hydroelectricity. It had its own hydroelectric power station using the waters from one of the streams that came off the mountains, and that was piped down to a building behind this castle where a hydroelectric generator provided electricity for the whole building. My first visit to this castle was some 50 years ago when we were surveying the island, and we got a little bit of a tour. It wasn't really in use at the time, but the community used the kitchen to show movies. And they had a big long kitchen table, and they put a sheet up on the end wall and put the projector on the table, and had a big kettle and lots of scones and cookies. And if the people liked a scene, you drummed on the table and they would stop and rewind and show that bit again. So the movie could last quite a while. But the other interesting characteristic of this was the bathroom, or at least the shower room part of it. You walked into this shower room and there were little nozzles sticking out left and right, front and back, and several set in the ceiling. And beside you was I suppose it was like one of these organ stops, you know, where you have different buttons that you press to engage different parts of the system. Well, that's how this worked. You pressed a button and water shot it at you from the side. And if you wanted it a little further round, instead of actually having to go to the bother of turning yourself, you could press another button and get a jet of water from a different direction. But your attention was drawn somewhat mesmerically to two buttons in front of you. One was blue and one was pink. And if you pressed the blue button, a jet of water came towards you from a little lower than waist height. And if you pressed the pink button, a jet of water sprang up between your feet. I pass no further comment on the toilet in Kinloch Castle. But Burroughs was a man who wanted to make an impression. And he decided that when he died, he wanted to be buried on Rum. And so he arranged to have a tunnel carved into one of the hillsides in Glen Harris. And he had it lined with decorated white tiles, Italian white tiles. And he'd finished the job, and some friends came up to see him and looked at this and said, you know, that just looks like a street lavatory in London. You know, there are lots of these underground, or there were at the time, lots of these underground toilets, white tiled. Well, he didn't really fancy having his mausoleum compared to an underground lavatory. So he built this instead. And this sits in all its glory in this desolate part of the island, desolate part of a desolate island. And that's his mausoleum. It looks only slightly more welcoming in these photos, but it's down in Glen Harris. That's where he decided he wanted to be buried, and that's where he is. And these are the mountains of Rum. The names are a bit strange. Halaval, Askaval, Trollval. The last one there gives you an inkling of where the name comes from. The Vikings really controlled a large part of the west coast of Scotland for a couple of centuries, and they applied those names to these hills because you could see these hills from a large distance away, and by looking at these hills and looking at the orientation of them, you could get an idea of where you were. So they were a navigational aid to the Vikings, and the names that the Vikings gave have stuck there. There were never enough people to rename them in any sense. There was never any urgency. There was never any need to rename them. So the Viking names from over 1,000 years ago are still with these mountain peaks. And this is the Glen of Kilmorey. It's round the corner a bit from Glen Harris, but again, it's bleak and desolate, and very few people ever lived there. The only folk who ever lived there were folk who looked after the sheep in the summer. It's not an island that would support any farming population, and therefore has always had very few people on it, despite its size. So now we're going to hop a little bit north, and we're going to the island of Skye. This is the one you've probably heard of. The strange island that is actually on land, but named after something celestial. And we're looking here from the south east. You can maybe just make out here the bridge that connects the island to the mainland. A bridge that was put up relatively recently, about 30 years ago. And the design of the bridge, it's a pretty high bridge, and the design was based on the fact that it had to be high enough to enable the Royal Yacht Britannia to pass underneath it, so that if the monarch decided to go on a cruise and decided to go up and down here, then he or she could get under the bridge. The irony is that the bridge had hardly been built when the government decided, in a fit of economy, that the country could no longer afford a royal yacht, and so it was taken out of service. The bridge, however, remains high enough to have allowed the royal yacht to pass through, had it ever wanted to. The royal yacht is still there. It's now a tourist attraction in Edinburgh. The crowning achievement of Skye, or the crowning feature of Skye, are the Cuillin Mountains up here, very popular with hill walkers and climbers. They present quite a challenge, partly because of their steepness and their ruggedness, and partly because they're out there and fully exposed to the weather. And the weather can change very quickly. If you think New England weather can change quickly, try the Scottish version. That's maybe where New England got the idea. I don't know. And again, to just give you some bearings, down in this area here is one of the most photographed castles in Scotland, Eilean Donan, which has a little causeway to get out to it, and it sits on an island of its own. Not a very big castle, but a very, very popular one. So this is the island of Skye, the biggest of the islands that we're looking at. And one of its main features is Dunvegan Castle. That's up in the northwest sort of end of the castle. And it's one of these, not really a defensive castle. I mean, there's a certain defensive element to it, but it would not be difficult to capture this even back in the days of the clans. It's built more as a grand house with some defensive features. Pretty popular as a tourist attraction. Here's a view of it from the water. So yes, it's got some ramparts, but not particularly thick. Nothing that would withstand bombardment from old-fashioned cannon from the sea. But it has a certain amount of grandeur, and it's the ancestral home of the Clan MacLeod. There's a little tea room there. It's open to the public. They'll sell you little souvenirs, models of the castle and all that sort of stuff. I don't find it, personally, I don't find it as grand or as interesting as some of the others, but certainly many people enjoy it. On the other side, on the northeast side, there is some amazingly rugged scenery, and this pinnacle is known as the Old Man of Storr, and it's a magnet for rock climbers who want to test their skills. Unfortunately, the road leading up to it, north of the island's capital, Portree, is disastrous. It's a long time since that road was built. There's been a huge amount of traffic going up and down it, far more than it was ever designed for. It's in pitiful condition. It's got potholes, and it's really an abomination of a road. But if you want to get to the Old Man of Storr and to see these things or climb these things, that's where you have to go. And it's sheer. You can see it's absolutely sheer. But to stand on the pinnacle here is quite a challenge, and it's a very popular destination. Just down the coast from it, the strange geology of the area has given rise to this. You can maybe make out the columns of basalt here and here. And because those columns resemble the pleats on the back of a kilt, this area is known as the Kilt Rocks. Because Skye is subject to a fair amount of rainfall, this stream apparently never dies out. It dries up. The water off the hills goes into a big peat bog area, and that holds the water as a reservoir so that the waterfall is constant. And another castle, this time at the southwest corner of Skye, is Armadale Castle. And it too, you can see, is just a house that kind of has been fortified a bit or made to look more like a castle than it really is. And that's all there is to this particular castle. There was a bit more. The arch here did lead into a big courtyard, but basically this is all that's left of Armadale Castle now. It does have extensive grounds and gardens, and they are quite pleasant to walk in. And it does have a little museum up at the back where they can tell you the story of some of the emigrant ships that left Skye for other destinations and carried the emigrants in conditions barely better than those of the slave ships that were crossing the Atlantic at the same time. Indeed, there were a good number of Scots who were transported to North America as slaves. Not all the slaves came from Africa. And this is a newer feature on the island of Skye, Sol Morostig, which basically means the school in the big barn. And the buildings are new, but the idea was that they literally set up a school which does all of its education in the Gaelic language. You can do all sorts of courses there, accountancy, filmmaking, and a number of others, but all in the Gaelic language. And we'll explain a wee bit more about that in a minute. But to get to it, you use a ferry. This is further down that same coast to the southwest, and this is the ferry that connects you to the mainland. So at one end of the island, there is a road bridge, which replaced a ferry, and at the other end, there is this particular ferry going over to Mallaig. And the castle we just looked at is just up, well, the woods are the edge of the castle, basically. Sol Morostig, the Gaelic college, sits here at, down towards the end of Mull, but it's part of a network of campuses that form the University of the Highlands and Islands. And you can see there's one in Perth, there's one over here, one in Fort William, a few in the Inverness area, out to Lewis, up to Thurso, Orkney, and Shetland. So this whole network forms the University of the Highlands and Islands. If you want to do navigation, then navigation is really done up here. That's where the School of Navigation is. That's where they have all the equipment that you need to do navigation. But English could be done online from any of these sites. So it's an interesting mix. There is an environmental studies course at this university, and one of the things they do is a field trip, and the students are simply asked to take the train that goes up here and then loops away around here through an almost empty part of the Highlands and goes up to Thurso and Wick. And their task as they take the train is to observe the land use and the human use. There's not much of that up here because nobody lives here. But they're asked to do observations as they undertake this journey. And apparently it's a very popular course. This is Portree, the capital of Skye. Portree, the Ree bit means the king. So Portree, the king's port. A somewhat grand title for a fairly small and even today a fairly sleepy little village. In the summer, yeah, it's busy with tourists. In the winter, it dozes, shall we say. And it's got these interesting multicoloured buildings. I always find that interesting. Some people love it, some people hate it, but certainly brightens it up a little. And way up in the far north of Skye, there is a monument to a lady known as Flora MacDonald. She was an interesting lady. She was around at the time of a certain Charles Edward Stuart. And the Stuarts had been kings. They had been on the UK throne, and they were Catholics, and they were replaced by a set of kings who were Protestants, and they didn't like that, and they felt they should be the kings. And so they tried to go back and raise rebellious forces and get back on the throne. First of all, the father tried in 1685, and then in 1715, and in both cases the rebellion was squashed. And then the son tried in 1745 and came ashore and raised an army, and they got well down into England. And as it happened, there was no government army in place to prevent them going to London. But the army consisted of clansmen who were all farmers, who needed to get back to set things up for the winter, look after their livestock, all that kind of thing. So the army kind of fizzled, and he retreated back up to Scotland, and his army was decisively defeated by the government army. Actually, the only time they lost in battle was in 1746 near Inverness at the Battle of Culloden. Charles Edward Stuart fled the battlefield as soon as he saw that he was on the losing side, and gathered all the money that was there to pay his army and fled. And it says much for the loyalty of his forces that in the 2 or 3 months after the battle, when the government forces chased him around the Highlands, nobody gave him away, nobody betrayed him. Gradually, though, he was forced towards the island of Skye, and that's where Flora MacDonald comes in. She was I suppose you would call a middle-class lady, had a lot to lose, but she disguised this gentleman as her maid, and they were rowed across to the island of Skye, where he could, for a while at least, keep out of the way of the government army. That required a fair amount of courage, because had she been discovered, she would have been taken to the Tower of London and executed. We may question her motives and question her political judgment, if you like, but her courage cannot be denied. And that's the little inscription on this memorial to her. Way out in the distance there are the islands where she was born, and it's to those same islands that Charles Edward Stuart made his way so that he could be rescued by a French frigate in the fullness of time. So from Skye, we're going to move all the way up north, all the way up here through Shetland to the island of Unst, which is in many ways the strangest of these islands. It's the place, Shetland is the place where they have the Uphellia festival. I regret to point out that that festival didn't take place this year and will not take place in 2022. It's been cancelled. This is the time of year when they start the detailed preparations for it, and so they had to cancel it now if it was going to be cancelled. So no Uphellia in Lerwick in January 22. For those who haven't seen anything about Uphellia, it ends up with a galley being burned, and then there's an all-night party, which is the real celebration. But this is Unst. Stretches from north to south. You come ashore down here at Belmont and go up this road, and there's really only two places where any number of people live, and one of them is Baltasound, which is in here, and the other is Haroldswick, which is up here. And there's a few little spur roads off here and there, but most of the population lives in Baltasound and Haroldswick. Fewer in Haroldswick, though. And look at the names, Wick. The Wick part means a bay. So this is the Bay of Harald, who was a Viking who landed and claimed it. The North Bay, well, that's a pretty good description of this one. Down here, we've got Underhool, which is, again, a Viking name, and Ting, West Ting. A Ting is a sort of parliament. So clearly the Vikings of the day probably met here to resolve disputes of one kind or another. The whole of Shetland tends to have these Viking names rather than Gaelic names because that's their history. Shetland is the newest part of Scotland. It was Norse until 1469. And this is the little ferry that gets you over to Unst. And there's really not much to keep you round about the area where the ferry brings you ashore. And if you go off the main road, you're on roads like this. Lots of these dry stone dikes built with local stone. Part of the reason is to keep out or to separate the sheep and keep them in an enclosure. But also it helps, the building of these things gets stone away from the area where the sheep are grazing. It clears the land a little. And there is a certain amount of cultivable land on Unst, but it's mainly a sheep growing area. And this is way up in the north. This is Norwich, just about as far north as you can go. And the beach at Norwich looks nice and peaceful, nice and calm. Very scenic in the summer. Very difficult to see in the winter. Remember, we're 60 degrees north. So in the summer, there is almost no daylight. In fact, in the summer, you can play golf at midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning quite happily. In the winter, there's hardly any daylight. This is a couple of features at the north end of Unst. Because it's so far north, it has always lent itself to the installation of radar systems. And we'll look at an older one later, but this is the Bubble. It's simply known as the Bubble. And it's a radar installation which dates back to roughly the 60s. The earlier radar was World War II, and radars looked very different in those days. But the Bubble is way up there, and the idea is that it can detect missiles launched by the USSR when it was built. You may, when you were at high school, have had these exercises where you try to hide under the table in the event of an attack. We didn't have to do any of that. We were going to get 4 minutes warning, and you can bet that certain people would get the 4 minutes, but the rest of us, the first thing we would know is when a bright flash went off. So we didn't have to worry about having to hide under the desks. Across the firth from that, this is Burghfirth here, across it is the old lighthouse station. This is where the lightkeepers' families lived while the men were off on Muckleflugga, the lighthouse at the north end of Unst. The old shore station was, well, when Muckleflugga went automatic, they didn't need this, so it was sold. And you can, some of it is private houses, as it were, but part of it is to do with the Nature Conservancy and the bird life up on the headland, up the hill here to the left. And this, well, was Scotland's most northerly golf course. It's hard to see it now because it's about 40 years since anybody played there. But just think about this. You're sending people up to these Northern Isles in World War II to build and then staff a radar station. And then in the Cold War, you've got people up there with a radar station, and there's not much to do. So there's all this land around the place, so they play golf on it. And the big thing about this golf course was that you could play right round the clock. You could go out for a game of golf at 10 o'clock at night, finish at 2 o'clock in the morning, still able to see everything quite happily. In fact, the darkest hour is 1 o'clock in the morning. So you could play golf up there without any worries. The course was largely used by the servicemen staffing these radar bases. And I believe the last time this was actually in use was the late 70s. So it's no longer the most northerly golf course, but think of the challenge Not so much of getting from here to there, but playing from here across to there. And you're not a professional, so you're not necessarily the best in the world. Apparently this little inlet here is well choked, or was at one time well choked with golf balls. And this is what some of these installations looked like. This is a bomb-proof shelter, so that if the Germans in World War II came to attack the radar station, the men would have a safe place to go. We'll come back to that kind of thing in a minute. This, well, this is not entirely true. The Unst doesn't have a rapid transit system, and although this is a bus from the 50s, they do have more modern vehicles on the roads at the moment. But in one aspect, the Unst rapid transit system is streets ahead of anything you will find pretty well anywhere else in the world. And that's in the quality of its bus shelters. This is the world-famous bus shelter in Baltasound, and you can be comfortable in there. There's even a TV set in it. And from time to time, just in case people get bored with the decor, they change it all round to something else. Now, however well-travelled you are, I don't know that you will ever have found a bus stop as comfortable as this. Here's another curious thing about the island of Unst. It is widely regarded as being the model for the island that features in the novel Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson's uncles and parents were engineers, and the Stevenson brothers were involved in building several lighthouses in Scotland. One of them was Muckleflugga. So young Robert Louis, coming up to Unst to see what was going on at Muckleflugga up here, would have been familiar with this island. And there is perhaps a passing resemblance between the island that he drew in his book and the island of Unst. Stevenson also wrote a book called Kidnapped, and that involves a shipwreck not far from Iona, and the hero is washed ashore not far from Iona on an island which was actually used as the construction base for a couple of lighthouses further west than Iona. So Robert Louis Stevenson was familiar with that area too, which is why it features so vividly in his book. Unst is getting to be quite famous, you see. This is a typical boat from the Shetland Islands. Very graceful lines, clearly a good sea boat. My grandfather used to have one of these, and sitting in there is a little engine, and it drives a little propeller here so that you could get about. They were used to get people from island to island in the days before there were too many ferries, and certainly before there were too many bridges. But you don't just need a motor. These boats are largely used these days for leisure purposes, and you either row them, and there are lots of little communities that have these boats, and they set up little regattas, and they wear, this is the fascinating bit, as a kid going up to see my grandparents, we went out in boats like this, and nobody wore life jackets or personal flotation devices. Never heard of such a thing. But these days, of course, you have to do that. And these boats can also be sailed. And there's a lively sailing, there's a lively sailing, I was going to say a sailing field, but there's a sailing community using these traditional boats. This is down at the south end of Unst, Munas Castle. And the really interesting thing about this is it's for sale. So if you want to buy a Scottish castle, Munas Castle up in Unst could be yours. I can't remember the list price, but as you can see, it's largely intact. It needs only a roof, windows, doors, electricity, plumbing, floors, insulation, and a few other things, but essentially the main part of the building is pretty sound. So Munas Castle could be yours. And the scenery that you would see is around Moonus Castle is the Shetland ponies, these small, hardy ponies that live on pretty rough grazing. Because the grazing is so poor, Shetland sheep are small, Shetland sheepdogs are small, Shetland ponies are small. And this is peat, which you'll find is still being used in quite a few parts of Shetland and certainly up in Unst. This is where the peat is cut. And first of all, it's stacked in a line along the top of the peat bank here so that the air can get through it and dry it. And then it's gathered into these little collections so that you can get it away by cart or in the back of a pickup truck or something like that, whatever you have. The aroma of peat reek, as we know it, the smoke from peat, is unmistakable. It's not the best of fuels, but if that's all you've got, that's what you use. And this is down at the south end of Unst, again reflecting the Viking heritage of this part of the world. This is St. Olaf's Church, so clearly Olaf is a Viking name, and this is a nice sheltered bay here, and there's the original building. So that's about 1,000 years old from the days when Vikings largely occupied these areas. Well, maybe not 1,000 years, more like 600 years in this instance. Just a small, simple church, but it still retains its name. And the cemetery is still used. You can see some fairly modern gravestones there. This far north, the Aurora Borealis is a fairly common feature. In different parts of Scotland, they're known as the Merry Dancers or the Northern Lights. And the aurora is spectacular. Sometimes it can be pretty muted, pretty low key, but at other times the whole of the sky lights up, usually with a greenish, bluish colour, occasionally bursts of red. And it is enormously spectacular at times. It's never static. There is always movement. It's always shimmering or leaping, or the colour is flashing across the sky. And as far north as Unst, it's seen fairly regularly. More of a reddish colour to this one. And this is the radar station, the World War II radar station that I referred to earlier. It's out on this headland, and we can still see some of the buildings. This is the big bomb-proof shelter for them, the main building. But here and here and here are the concrete blocks on which stood lattice towers stretching way up. World War II radar at the time consisted of several of these towers with with long wires suspended between them, and that's the radar of the day. And this was a radar station that was up here because from here you could see north and you could see over towards Norway, and it was really to detect any effort by the Germans to get their warships out of the North Sea and into the Atlantic,
Bro,
which
we don't give a shit.
they would
Shut
pose
the
a
fuck
threat.
Yes, let's fucking go.